Hello everybody, my name is Edward Thompson. I am a principal consultant at CDW, and today we're going to be looking at how we can utilize PowerShell to look at some role and attribute sync changes and preview those before we move it into production. So what often happens is you have a sandbox environment and you may not have all the users and data there to accurately understand what will happen when these things are enabled. And so these two scripts, along with kind of some initial setup, will allow you to have more confidence as to when you enable the roles and enable the attribute sync, that everything will go smoothly. A few prerequisites. So for the role preview, we want to have some access profiles created but left disabled and attach some of the entitlements onto those. That way we can link up those two objects for the script. Also, we'll have some roles which will be enabled. They'll have membership criteria and the access profiles will be attached to those. Then we can go ahead and run the script, review the output. It will be in a CSV file, so it's easily imported into something like Excel or any other tool. You can see what's going to happen, and then if at any point everything looks good, you can enable the access profiles, let the provisioning go downstream. Or we can adjust the role criteria and maybe see a role has too many users and we need to look into that. And then we'll apply the changes, return to step 3, and have that iterative process so that we can be confident that everything's working smoothly. The other script we're going to look at is for attribute sync. So in a similar way, some prerequisites that we're expecting are the configuring of identity attributes, and the create profile on the source is configured with some of those identity attributes. That way, when we run the script, it knows which ones are eligible for attribute sync. Also, we're going to make sure that the accounts have been aggregated. That way the data is loaded in there, and so when we're looking at the account attributes, that's populated, and we can compare those against the identity attributes. Like the other script, it'll also output to a CSV, so we'll run that report. We'll look at the report in Excel, and then at any stage we can turn on attribute sync, let those changes flow downstream. Or maybe at this point we see that something's off, we want to adjust a transform. We'll go back in, do that change, refresh the users for that identity profile, and then return to step 4, kind of again, another one of those iterative processes, so we can see, keep making those changes until we're good with it, and turn everything back on. So first, we're going to start up with the role preview. So again, this is we're going to see what entitlements will be added when you turn on the roles. That way, you have confidence that you're not going to over provision too many roles to the users. Here is an example of the CSV output in Excel. So just as an example, in column A, we have the entitlement name. So you will see on the left, a couple fellowship in the ring. Column B is the count. So this is the number of users that have this role but do not have the entitlement. So if you were to enable this, that many users will get the entitlement in column A. Column C, it's a number of users with this entitlement. This is just to give extra context, and so you know how many users currently have that entitlement. So for example, maybe there's 1,000 users that are going to be added to this entitlement, but and the number of users that currently have it is also 1,000. So what you're going to do is you're going to be doubling the number of people that have this access. So maybe that's something to look into. Likewise, maybe the number of users that already have it is 20,000. So maybe that 1,000 increase is not noticeable, so it's good to move forward. Column D and E are just the respective role and access profile names, so that way you can know which one to look into if you need adjust the role criteria, or maybe adjust the entitlements on that access profile. Column F is the search query. So if you want to look into those 7 users and see what attributes do they have, why do they have this role, you can copy out that string, put it into the search UI, and play around with the data and see what users currently have this role. And then the last column, G, that's just, again, the search query to get column C. So if you want to see what users currently have this entitlement, you can put that in, look through it, and make adjustments to the role based on current users that have that entitlement. All right, so let's get into the demo. So looking over here, this is the script, and these will all be made available online after the presentation. I just want to point to the bottom of the script here where we have some parameters to configure. So here you'll input your tenant name and your domain. So most of the times it'll just be identity now, but sometimes you'll have a demo tenant which you need to specify that. You can supply a token. So if you just want to get up and running and run this really quickly, you can throw that token in there, run it one time, and not a lot of setup required. You can also supply your client ID and secret, and that will just dynamically get your token when needed. You can also supply the output directory, so this will be where your CSV files will live after this script has been run. And then another parameter you can pass in is the role filter. So by default, it'll get all the roles, all the access profiles in your tenant, but sometimes if you want to limit the scope down to just a set number of roles, it will kind of speed up the script process if you have a large number of roles in your tenant. So that could be an example of maybe the name of all your roles starts with AD, you can add that in there, or maybe you want to sort by just the roles created in the last 7 days, you can do that too. I'll also point out here, there's also a filter for access profiles. A warning though is that you need to include all of the access profiles that are under those roles. Otherwise, the script won't know how to, link up the two objects. And then we are just doing some simple checks to make sure your token and authorization is set up. And let's go ahead and run this script. I'm going to expand this a little bit. Okay. And so you see at the top here, it's just outputting the number of roles, number of access profiles that it received from your tenant. And then under that, it'll go through each of those roles. Here it's just listing out in green the name of that role. And then in blue, it's the name of the entitlement. And then right under that, we can see that's where that count of 7 comes from. So 7 users have the role fellowship, but they're missing the entitlement that is under that role. And so this will just run through, and you can kind of track the progress of the script as it's running. But the bulk of it, which you want to review, is actually in this CSV file down here. So we can go ahead and open this in Excel. Pull this over. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Okay. So here again, we went over what these columns are, but some of the things to point out here is that maybe you want to add a filter here, and most of the times we'll sort on this count here by descending. So in this example, we have 6 roles, so it's easy to see all on one screen, but if you have something like 500 roles and you want to see what's the highest priority, you can sort by this count and tackle them one at a time and go see what is going on with these roles. So if we take a look at the first one here, we can copy out this string. go into the tenant and go to the search page. Plug this in. And here we get back the results of those 7 users. So if we want to see, what's making up this role, we can go ahead and, add on any of these attributes. So want to look at their position, for example, we can go through and look at that and kind of bounce back and forth between the role criteria and the search page to understand, what's going on with this role. Let me go back. Let's see. So with that, I'm going to jump back over to the slides. And we're going to talk about attribute sync. So oftentimes, attribute sync, you'll have transforms configured, and you know that maybe in the lower environment, the attributes look all good for all your test cases, all your example users, but oftentimes you'll enter into a system and there'll be a number of users that already exist there, and maybe over time manual changes have occurred, their first name, their last name, display name, things like that get modified just the way they like it, and it may not conform exactly to the way that you have configured your transforms. And so this is useful to see what changes are in place on the identity side and the account side and see kind of where those mismatches may lie. Get those resolved before you turn on attribute sync and run into issues later on the line. Again, we're going to look at an example of the CSV file here. So it might be a little bit small here, but essentially the mappings or the header here will list out the identity attribute on the left and the account attribute on the right. So we can see things like the email is mapped to email, the UID is mapped to external ID, and that'll just give you an idea of what is being mapped to what, so you can look at the create profile, maybe look at the identity attributes, see where you need to make any adjustments. Down below in the values, you'll see the word synced. So if the 2 attributes from both sides match case sensitively, it'll just put the word synced, and that's helpful because you can go ahead and apply a filter, and as you're going through each column, filter out all those that are synced because you already know there's no changes that's going to occur downstream. So there's no use, looking at it and adjusting for that. If it's not synced, then the value will be the identity attribute on the left and the account attribute on the right, separated by a pipe in the middle. So that way you can see that if you turn this on, that value will go from left to right. And then also, if the cell has no value on the account or even the identity attribute, you'll see nothing after the pipe symbol. So for example, down below, we have the email. So this is telling us that based on what's configured in the system, nobody has an email. And if you were to turn on attribute sync, all of those emails will get synced across. So that's something to look into. And now we're going to go back to the demo for attribute sync. Go ahead and hide this. And again, this is going to look very similar to the other script here, your basic tenant and authorization configuration. One thing to note is that there is a source name, so you'll supply the source name that you want to work with, and it'll automatically look up the source ID and use that within the script. You'll supply the output directory of wherever your CSV files will go, and then it'll get nested under a folder for that source name, so it'll kind of delineate there. One optional list that you can pass in is these identity attributes. So these will list out just the value of the identity attribute for the user. This makes it easier for understanding the context of who owns this account. So the UID will tell you, the user that owns this account. So likewise, you can add in the display name, so that way you can understand, oh, this is Edward Thompson, and understand who this account maps to in case the account maybe isn't as obvious. And then the third one we have here as an example is the lifecycle state. So oftentimes you'll be looking at a report for attribute sync, and maybe you don't care about all the users that are inactive. This allows you to filter those out and only look at the ones that you care about, and maybe you're not as concerned about those inactive users. You can add a list of attributes here, maybe a job title or a department, and add those in as filters. Again, we'll just have checks on that the authorization is set correctly, and I'll go ahead and run this. Okay, so here's what the output will look like. Again, we're running this for this source that's called network. We have the source ID here, and below is a list of the mappings that were pulled directly from the create account provisioning policy. On the left here in the name column, this is the name of those attributes in the create policy. So the downstream application has things like given name, username, external ID. And then the value is the value of the identity attribute that is being mapped to that attribute. So for example, the UID is what's being mapped to the external ID, email to email, etc. So now we can go ahead and look at this file here that generated. And try that one more time. Okay, give me 1 second. Oh, I know what's going on here. And now we'll open it. And we'll make this a little bit bigger. So, like I mentioned in the past, these three are the identity attributes. So just to give a little bit of context on the user, you can see what their user ID is, whether they're active, the display name. This is just a direct mapping of what the display name is. Here we have the account name. So if the account name is distinguishing of the user, we can see that here. And one thing I'll point out here is that we see this is where there's some weird conversions when you pull it into Excel. Right here, there's some characters, and one thing to always look at is if you go back to the CSV file here, and we open it up just in plain text, what we can see is that this right here, has a little accented O character, and this doesn't get translated into Excel very well. So if you see those, just keep in mind that sometimes you want to look at it in plain text just to ensure that that is working smoothly. Jump back over into Excel. The next thing to look at here are all of the mappings that you have here. So for example, we have first name being mapped to given name, display name being mapped here, and one thing that we're noticing is that we can filter on all of these. And here's where we can uncheck the synced options. So in this instance, we have roughly 15 users. It's easy to see it all on one screen, but most systems don't have that. They have more thousands or upwards of 10,000 or 20,000 users, and you want to filter out all those that are synced and just look at the ones that aren't synced to understand. So if we turn on sync, Samwise is going to overwrite Sam, Mary is going to change spelling, and ensure that everything there looks good, and we'd be able to turn that one on. Now, display name looks a little bit different. Every single user here is a mismatch. Now, that should be a red flag that not every user should have a mismatch from your downstream system. And if we're looking at all these, we see that there's a lot of uppercase in here, and this is linked to the last name. So the last name, something is occurring here, everything is in all caps, but in the downstream system, it's regular. So let's take a look at that. If we go back to the identity profile, let's open that up. Go to mappings. And we're looking at the last name field here. So we see for the first name, the transform that's being applied is normalize. But last name, the transform here is being too upper. It's making everything uppercase. So let's go ahead and make that change. It should be normalized. So this is where we'll go ahead and save that. We'll apply the changes, let that process. This process may take a couple of minutes. It could take upwards of half an hour to an hour, depending on the number of users that are in your system. Let's go back to this and move to some other attributes here in the list. Username, this looks fine. Nothing too concerning here. The UID being mapped to external ID, this is synced across the board, which makes sense because this is being used for correlation, and we wouldn't want to turn an attribute sync for this anyways. And then the last one here, we have the email. So this one, we can see that pipe symbol at the end. This means that there is no value in the downstream system for email. Now, let's take a look at that. If I go to connections and sources, scroll down to network, and look at the account schema, and I'll put in email. You can see here that the attribute name is primary email, but in our mapping, it's just email. So these two are kind of a mismatch with the mapping. Now, if we go back to the VS Code extension, we can go ahead and look at that create provisioning policy. Let's go ahead and cannot open. Okay, let's refresh this. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and make this change here. So ideally, we'd want to update this email field to be primary email to fix that mapping. And that way, we would see all of the account attributes that are primary email, and that would update on our CSV report. But since I can't make that change, we'll go ahead and run this script one more time now that we have refreshed the transform on the last name. Again, same thing, we're getting that source, the mapping, and outputs to a new file here. Go ahead and open that file. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And zoom in. And so now that we have made the change to the transform, refresh the users, we can now see that on this last name here, much more of the users are synced because the case is the same. And we just have a handful of users where, gray is being changed, Dark Lord, Smeagol, etc. And that also is being carried over into the display name. So now we'd be able to go back in, go to attribute sync, enable these that we were good with, save that, and go ahead and sync those across, and have some confidence that looking at this CSV file, these are the values that are going to get sent across. And you can continue to maybe not turn all these on at once. You turn on one, let it refresh down system, see if there's any errors that are popping up, and then rerun the script again and kind of have that iterative process to see what attributes are in sync and what users may be having issues. Okay. Go back to the slides here. So the script for both of these will be available on the page for this presentation. On that, we'll have listings of all the parameters that we went through and the more details about what it can do. The other thing is that maybe you see improvements. Go ahead and leave those down in the comments. We can kind of workshop that and see what will speed up the process, or maybe you have a different use case that this can be applied to. Again, this is Edward Thompson, and thank you for your time.